They thought I was finished. They thought the moment my son stood up at his own graduation dinner and told 200 people that my work embarrassed him, that I would quietly fold myself away like an old newspaper and disappear. I had spent 37 years building something real, something honest, something I was proud of, and in less than 60 seconds, my own flesh and blood tried to burn it to the ground. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been ready for that moment for a very long time. My name is Raymond Calloway. I am 63 years old, and I have lived in the same town in regional New South Wales my entire life. Dungog. Population just under 2,000. The kind of place where everyone knows your ute, your dog, and your business. I grew up there, went to the local high school, left at 17 to start working with my father on his plumbing business, and never looked back. People in the city sometimes look at men like me and see limitation. They see dirt under fingernails and a sun-damaged neck, and they think, small life. What they don't see is the discipline it takes to run a trade business for nearly 4 decades. The early mornings, the flooded crawl spaces, the Saturday calls, the years of showing up when everyone else was sleeping in. My wife, Margaret, passed away 14 years ago from ovarian cancer. We had 2 children together, our daughter, Elise, who was 24 when her mother died. Margaret was the warmth in our house. I was the structure. Together we made something that worked. After she was gone, I held the structure together as best I could. But I will be honest, I mark in 17. I mark in 17 Refern. I was a man who knew how to fix a burst pipe at 2 in the morning, but did not always know how to talk about grief at the kitchen table. I did my best. I showed up. I kept the business running. I made sure both my children had what they needed. Cooper was the one who always wanted more. Not more in a hungry, ambitious way. More in a way that was about appearances. He wanted the right clothes, the right postcode, the right friends. When he was a teenager, he told Margaret that he was embarrassed to bring friends home because our house smelled like pipe sealant. She laughed it off. I tried to as well. Kids say things. We told ourselves he'd grow out of it. He didn't entirely, but he softened for a while in his 20s. He went to university in Newcastle, studied business, and came back with a degree and a girlfriend named Priya. I liked Priya. She was sharp, practical, and she laughed at my jokes even when they weren't funny, which I took as a sign of good character. They dated for 4 years, and I genuinely thought that chapter of Cooper wanting to distance himself from where he came from was behind us. Then they broke up. I never got the full story, but within 6 months, Cooper had met someone new. Her name was Sienna Hartwell. Her family was from the North Shore of Sydney old money, or at least the performance of it. Her father, Douglas Hartwell, was a property developer who wore linen shirts and had opinions about wine that he enjoyed sharing at volume. Her mother, Carolyn, looked at me the first time we met the way you look at a piece of furniture that doesn't match the room. I tried not to read too much into it. People are people. Class snobbery is as old as time, and usually says more about the insecure than the insulted. I smiled. I shook hands. I brought a good bottle of red to the dinner they hosted in their harborside home. Douglas made a joke about tradies, and I laughed along. I was not going to let other people's smallness make me small. What I did not anticipate was how quickly Cooper started to absorb their way of seeing things. It happened gradually, the way these shifts always do. Small things at first. He stopped mentioning to new acquaintances what I did for a living. When Sienna's friends asked about his family, he'd say his father ran a business in regional NSW and leave it at that. I found out through Elise, who'd been at a dinner in Sydney where someone asked Cooper directly and he'd said, very casually, that his father was in construction management. Elise told me this on the phone, and I remember sitting very still for a moment before I said anything. Construction management. 37 years of plumbing. 17 employees at peak. a business I'd built from nothing, and my son had quietly reclassified it to something that sounded more acceptable at a dinner party in Mosman. I didn't confront him about it. I should have, probably. But I am not a man who starts fires in the middle of a room. I stored it away. I watched. I paid attention. And $80. The engagement happened 18 months later. Cooper proposed to Sienna at a restaurant in Sydney. He called me the next morning, and I told him I was happy for him, and that I hoped they'd build something real together. I meant both things. Whatever my concerns, Sienna was not a bad person. She was a product of her environment, as most of us are, and I wanted my son to be happy. The planning of the wedding was where things started to deteriorate properly. Douglas Hartwell had very specific ideas about what the wedding should look like. A venue in the Hunter Valley, 200 guests, a 3-course dinner, a band, a photo booth, flowers that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He presented this plan to Cooper and Sienna over a weekend I was not invited to. When Cooper rang me to discuss it, he used the phrase, "the kind of wedding Sienna deserves," and I had to take a breath. I asked what the budget was. He told me. I asked who was paying. There was a pause. It turned out Douglas Hartwell. Despite the linen shirts and the harborside home and the very loud wine opinions, had structured his finances in a way that made him technically cash poor, in ways that were convenient. The property development business had been going through what Cooper called a restructuring period. In plain terms, Douglas could not comfortably pay for the wedding he had planned without it causing him genuine difficulty. So they looked at me. Cooper rang on a Tuesday evening. I remember because I'd just finished a job out past Patterson, and I was still in my work clothes when he called. He explained the situation with the careful tone of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say. He said he knew it was a lot to ask. He said Sienna was his person, and this day meant everything to her. He said he would pay me back over time. The figure he quoted was $85,000. I want to be clear about something. I have money. Not Hartwell money, not Harborside House in Sydney money, but over 37 years of running a trade business, investing carefully, and living modestly. I had done well. I owned my home outright. I had superannuation that would see me comfortably through retirement. I had a separate investment property in Maitland that I'd bought 12 years prior. I was not wealthy in the way that gets you into rooms with Douglas Hartwell, but I was secure. And importantly, I was the kind of man who would spend $85,000 on his son's wedding if asked properly. I said yes, not because I felt pressured, but because I loved my son and I wanted him to have the day he wanted. But I also quietly opened a folder on my computer that evening, and I started keeping records. Every transfer, every invoice, every conversation. Not out of malice at that point. Not yet, but because I am a tradesman, and tradesmen document everything. It is how you stay protected. It is how you stay honest. The months of planning that followed were a study in small exclusions. Cooper and Sienna handled everything with Carolyn Hartwell. My input was not sought on the venue, the menu, the guest list, the seating, or the table decorations. When I offered to help source the flowers through a woman I knew who ran a garden in Singleton, Cooper said they'd already sorted it. When I suggested a local band from the Hunter who I'd seen play at a function and thought were fantastic, he said Sienna had her heart set on someone specific. I was the funding mechanism. I was not a participant. Elise noticed it too. She pulled me aside at a family dinner about 3 months before the wedding and said, quietly, "Dad, are you okay with how all this is going?" I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way her mother used to look at me when she knew I wasn't telling the full truth. The week before the wedding, I drove down to Sydney for the rehearsal dinner at the Hartwells' home. I arrived in my car, a clean, reliable Land Cruiser that I'd had for 8 years, and parked behind what I can only describe as a fleet of European luxury vehicles. Douglas met me at the door with a handshake that communicated something just slightly south of welcome. Carolyn offered me a glass of champagne with a smile that did not reach her eyes. I drank it and I smiled back, and I was pleasant to every single person in that room, because I am my father's son, and my father raised me to conduct myself with dignity regardless of how others conduct themselves. At the table, there was a moment when Douglas was telling a story about a project he'd done in the Whitsundays, and someone asked me, conversationally, what I did. Before I could answer, Cooper, who was sitting 3 seats away, said, "Dad's in facilities management," and moved the conversation on. I put my fork down. I picked it up again. I ate my meal. I said nothing. But something shifted in me that night. Something that had been slowly tightening over many months reached a point where I could feel it clearly. This was not going to resolve itself. My son was not going to walk back from this on his own, and if I did nothing, I would spend the rest of my life being quietly erased from the version of himself that Cooper was constructing. I drove back to my hotel that night, and I made some calls. One of them was to my solicitor, a woman named Helen Pratt, who had handled my business affairs for 20 years and who I trusted completely. Another was to my accountant, and one was to Elise, who listened to everything I said and then was quiet for a moment and then said, "What do you need from me, Dad?" The wedding was held on a Saturday in late April at a vineyard property in the Hunter Valley. The weather was exactly right, that particular quality of autumn light you get in the Hunter that makes everything look like it's been lit by someone who knows what they're doing. 200 guests, a string quartet for the ceremony. The band Sienna had wanted, flowers that I had paid for without complaint. Tables set in a way that suggested significant professional involvement. I sat at the family table. Douglas and Carolyn were on my left. Elise was on my right, and she kept her hand near mine in a way that told me she was paying attention. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Whatever else was happening beneath the surface, Cooper and Sienna standing together in that light and making those promises to each other was real. I watched my son's face when Sienna walked towards him, and I felt the complicated love that parents feel, joy and grief and pride and worry all running together. I thought about Margaret. I thought about how much she would have wanted to be there. I thought about how she would have cried from the first note of the processional and not been embarrassed about it at all. The reception moved through the way receptions do, entrees, speeches from the bridal party, the cutting of the cake. Douglas gave a speech that was largely about Douglas. Carolyn cried beautifully, as though she had practiced. The best man told a story about Cooper that was affectionate and funny and landed well with the room. Then the MC announced that the groom's father would like to say a few words. I had not told Cooper what I was going to say. He was expecting something short, something appropriate, something that would not embarrass him, and he was right that I had something prepared. He just didn't know what it was. I stood up. The room was warm and full, and every table was lit by candles, and the Hunter Valley evening was happening just beyond the open doors. I thanked everyone for coming. I said some true things about marriage, that it is not a ceremony but a practice, that it requires more honesty than romance, that the quality of a life together is built in the ordinary days, not the extraordinary ones. People were nodding. A few women had their hands pressed together. Then Cooper leaned back in his chair slightly, the way someone does when they think the difficult part is over. I said, "Before I finish, I want to share something, because I think it matters, on a day like today, to be clear about where we come from." I saw Elise reach for her water glass. I said, "Many of you may know that Cooper introduced me tonight and at the rehearsal dinner, and at several other occasions over the past 18 months as being in facilities management, or construction management, or, on one occasion I'm told, the resources sector." I paused. A few people laughed uncertainly. I am a plumber. I have been a plumber for 46 years. My father was a plumber. I built Calloway Plumbing and Gas from 2 vans and a second-hand pipe bender into a business that has employed, at various times, 23 people from this region. It is honest work. It is skilled work. It is work I am proud of. The room was very quiet. I'm also the person who paid for this evening. I said it without edge. Simply, as a statement of fact. And I want Cooper to know and I want Sienna to know that I didn't do that because I wanted anything in return. I did it because I love my son, and because I believe that what we give to the people we love is an expression of who we are. The name Calloway has been connected to this valley for 3 generations. It is a name that means something. I hope, in time, you'll both feel that way too. I sat down. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then someone at a far table began to clap, and it moved through the room like a wave. Cooper was not clapping. Cooper was sitting very still, and his face had the particular quality of a man who has just understood something he cannot undo. What I had not told him, what I had been very careful not to tell him, because I wanted him to understand it fully in that moment, was what I had done in the weeks before the wedding. I had met with Helen Pratt, and I had updated my will. The investment property in Maitland, which had appreciated significantly and was now worth just under $900,000, I had transferred into a family trust with Elise, named as the managing trustee. The business, which I had been intending to pass to Cooper when I retired, I had also restructured, not to exclude him entirely, but to reflect the reality of what I had observed. A son who was ashamed of what that business represented would not be a good steward of it. I had also, and this is the part that Helen had raised an eyebrow at, not in disapproval but in professional appreciation, prepared a detailed summary of every financial contribution I had made to Cooper over the past 3 years. The $85,000 for the wedding, the $52,000 I had lent him when his Sydney apartment deposit fell short 2 years earlier, a loan he had described to Sienna's family, I later learned, as a family gift, the $18,000 for the car, the various smaller amounts. It totaled just over $170,000. Helen had sent a letter politely worded, professionally appropriate to Cooper's address the week before the wedding, noting that these amounts, to the extent they had been documented as loans, would be accounted for in the estate planning, and that he would be welcome to discuss the matter at a time of his choosing. After my speech, Cooper found me near the bar during the band's first set. He looked like a man trying to have 2 different conversations at once, the one about the speech and the one about the letter, and not being sure which one to start with. He said my name once. Then he said, "Dad, that letter." I said, "Cooper, tonight is your wedding night. We can talk about all of it. There is no emergency, and nothing is happening that can't be discussed properly. But tonight is for you and Sienna, and you should go and be present for that." He looked at me for a long moment. I could see him working through it. His father was not angry. His father was not making a scene. His father was standing at the bar at his wedding, holding a glass of Shiraz from the vineyard that his father had paid for, and smiling at him with something that was not triumph and not hurt, but something more complicated than either. He said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know. We'll talk." Elise found me later in the evening, out near the vineyard fence where the lighting from the marquee faded out and you could see stars. She stood beside me for a while, then she said, "He's been in the corner with Sienna for about 20 minutes. I think she's asking questions." I said I thought that was probably a good thing. She put her arm through mine and leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she had done since she was about 4 years old. And we stood there looking at the dark rows of vines and the sky above them. And I thought about Margaret and about my father and about the particular weight of things that get passed down through families, both the good and the possible. Things that have to be corrected. I thought about a conversation I'd had with my father when I was about 20, when I'd come home from a job embarrassed because a mate's father, a bank manager, had made a comment about tradesmen at a barbecue. My father had listened to the whole story and then said, "Raymond, the man who calls the bank manager when his pipes burst is not the one who should be embarrassed." I had been carrying that sentence for 43 years. In the months that followed the wedding, Cooper and I had several long conversations. Some of them were difficult. He was honest with me in a way that he perhaps hadn't been in years about the pressure he'd felt around Sienna's family, about his own insecurities, about the way he'd allowed other people's values to quietly replace his own. I listened. I did not make it easy for him by rushing to forgiveness, because I think real repair requires real confrontation. But I also did not withhold the forgiveness when it was genuinely offered. The financial matters were addressed. The loans were acknowledged and a repayment arrangement was put in place, not because I needed the money, but because a debt that is named is a debt that can be cleared, and I wanted him to have the experience of clearing it. The will and the trust stood as written, with a note that things could be revisited in time as circumstances warranted. Douglas Hartwell, for his part, never raised the wedding costs with me directly, which I thought was wise of him. Sienna, over the year that followed, surprised me. She came to Dungog one weekend with Cooper in August, and she walked around the property and asked genuine questions about the business and the history of the area. She was not performing interest, she was actually interested. She told me that her own grandfather had been a shearer in Western Queensland, and that her family's wealth was only 2 generations old, which Douglas Hartwell had apparently spent considerable energy obscuring. I found that I liked her more after that than I had before. I turned 64 in September. Elise threw a small dinner at my house, 12 people I'd known for decades. The kind of gathering where everyone in the room has a genuine claim to being there. Cooper gave a speech. He used the word plumber 5 times. The 5th time, he was laughing, and so was I. I think about my father often, about what it means to hand something down. Not money, not property, though those things matter, but a way of being in the world. A refusal to shrink. An understanding that the value of work is not in how it sounds at a dinner party, but in whether it is done well, done honestly, and done in service of something real. Cooper is still learning that. I believe he will get there. I believe most people, given time and honesty and love that refuses to be anything other than itself, will get there. My name is Raymond Calloway. My father was a plumber. I am a plumber. And in 46 years of arriving at people's homes when something had broken and leaving those homes with things working again, I have never once been ashamed of what I do. The guests at that wedding saw a man stand up and refuse to disappear. What I hope they saw, and what I hope my son now understands, is that dignity is not something you are given by the room you're standing in. It is something you carry with you, and no one, not a harborside address, not a table full of people in expensive clothes, not even your own child on the most important day of his life can take it from you unless you hand it over. The work you do with your hands is not less than the work you do with a spreadsheet. The town you grew up in is not less than the city you moved to. And the name you were born with is not less than the name you are trying to borrow. Teach your children who they are before the world tells them who they should be. Because once they've taken on someone else's version of themselves, the way back is long, and it requires more honesty than most people are comfortable with. Start the conversation early. Have it at the dinner table, in the ute on the way to school, in the quiet moments before bed. Tell them where you came from. Tell them why it matters. Tell them that the measure of a person is not what they own or how they sound, but whether they can look the people who love them in the eye and say, I am not ashamed of where I come from. I am not ashamed of what I've built. I am not ashamed of my name. That is the inheritance worth leaving.